Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webcast, The Role of Global Talent Mobility in Times of Crisis, sponsored by Topia, and it will be presented by Nina Brenneman. This webcast has been pre-approved for 1 HRCI Global credit and 1 SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have questions during the Q&A, please click Q&A in your webinar controls and type your questions there. Once the presentation has begun, I will post a link to the slides and an exit survey in the chat area. A new tab will open in your browser with the survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast has ended. All right, it is now my absolute pleasure to turn it over to today's presenter, Nina Brenneman.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. First, I want to just start off by saying thank you for joining us today. It is a great pleasure that people are taking time out of their busy day today to hear me talk about this very key topic. So before I launch into it, I just want to give you a little bit of background about myself. So I am Nina Brenneman. I'm a solutions consultant at Topia, and I help customers understand how global talent mobility technology can help drive them towards success. So making sure that companies can effectively deploy, manage, and engage their global talent. And I have a background in the mobility industry. Actually, I worked in-house for a number of years. And as part of that, I developed a really keen interest in all things technology. So I worked on a number of projects looking at the global mobility technology that was on the market at the time, and also developed a couple of in-house tools. And ultimately, that's what landed me at Topia. And what I learned during my time in-house is actually, I came through a number of different crises as part of that, both on a smaller and slightly larger scale, and understanding how that really impacts the role of mobility. So for today, we're going to take a look at, first of all, what is mobility today? I think, as you're all probably very familiar with, it's a role that's ever evolving, and there are a lot of challenges just on a day-to-day basis. Then we're going to look at, then we're going to look at the role of mobility specifically in a crisis. So what are some of the key challenges that you face in a crisis situation? We're going to take a look at how you can go about assessing your program's crisis preparedness. So thinking about, where do you fall on the scale of preparedness? Do you feel like you're ready to go, set at any crisis, or are you potentially sort of reacting as things happen? And also, if you are prepared, thinking about any potential blind spots that you might have in your plan. Then we're going to look at a couple of things you might want to consider to think about increasing your response effectiveness. So it's great if you have a plan, but how can you essentially supercharge it and make sure that it is as key as possible to be able to deliver in that critical time? And then finally, looking at setting your company up for post-crisis success. So I think that's probably very relevant to where a lot of people are right now with our current global crisis, starting to think about what is a post-COVID world going to look like? What do we need to do to come through this and come out the other side? So first of all, thinking about what is global talent mobility. So global talent mobility is the platform that empowers HR teams to be able to effectively deploy, manage, and engage their employees across the world. And this typically centers around the physical movement of employees to enable an organization to deliver on their strategy and their wider objectives for success. And this can be anything from moves that last up to a few years, so thinking about your long-term assignees, or even down to a few days if business travelers also falls within your remit. It can, of course, both be domestically and internationally, and each come with their own sets of challenges. And it can be often used for development of top talent as well as cross-border recruiting. So if you're looking at a war for talent, which is really the case across a lot of industries today, being able to effectively hire and relocate someone can be a key differentiator for you. So thinking about the role of mobility today, so actually it can be a little bit of a challenge in itself. So the role of mobility is pretty complex on a day-to-day basis. And what we see is that new challenges continually crop up. So mobility teams are having to deal with increasingly complex talent mobility landscapes on a day-to-day basis. So thinking about some of the things we see here, like regular changes to tax and immigration legislation. If you have populations in Europe, you might have been affected by Brexit. You might be very familiar with the Posted Workers Directive. And also what we're seeing is actually business travelers tend to be falling into the remit of global mobility more and more often. So these things are all normal day-to-day challenges that you're having to deal with on an ongoing basis. And a number of these have actually been around for a while, but continue to evolve and cause new challenges as they change. So it's quite hard to say that you're ever really done with dealing or preparing for these. You kind of just get to a point where they're part of your new normal. But the difference here is that this set of challenges are known changes coming up. So yes, they can have an impact on cost, planning, and so on. But the key point is that typically these have a reasonable lead time. And I say reasonable with quotation marks. I know that's not always the case, but generally it means that they're easier to plan for, assess, prepare, and take action as required. So what's different about a crisis situation, you might think? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the definition of a crisis. So a crisis is defined as a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, or a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. So as you can see, actually when you're looking at the definition of crisis, you could argue that this definition covers a lot of what is just day-to-day mobility actions. So how specifically does the role of mobility change in that crisis situation? So firstly, and most key, is that there's a critical need to act quickly, as this is typically a situation that impacts the physical safety of your employees. And you, as the employer, of course, have a duty of care to them. Now, note for a moment that I said act rather than react, and there's going to be more on this later when we get into the crisis preparedness piece. In a crisis situation, time is of the essence, and you do not have the luxury of reacting. So what we typically see in a crisis situation is that mobility teams by default end up being the masterminds of all the different strands that come together to support the employee and the business through the crisis. So whether it's dealing with international healthcare implications, maybe someone's been caught mid-transit and you have to figure out if they've got cover in this third location, dealing with immigration implications for employees, or modeling costs for various scenarios for the business to give them the data they need to be able to make their decisions and do their planning. And when you think about it, there have actually been a number of crises challenges over the last decade. So think of natural disasters, various terror incidences, and much more. However, it's worth noting that often these are confined to either a particular city, country, or region. And rarely have we seen anything that's had such a widespread and complete global impact as we're seeing right now with COVID-19. However, this also creates a unique opportunity to learn how better to prepare and get all relevant stakeholders involved. So the reality is that everyone's likely affected by the current situation, meaning it's not just a regional problem that one part of your organization has to deal with. There's a vested interest for all global parties now to ensure that your companies are as well prepared as you can be for any future crisis situations that might occur. So when do you know that you need to act? When do you foresee a situation where you need to put a crisis plan into action? So think about the situation triggers and identifiers. What are the signals? So looking at COVID-19, could you have acted earlier if you had been better informed about the impact to your organization in China, for example? Were there other signals, countries closing down quicker than the country you're located in, that might have indicated that you needed to take action? So how do you get ahead of the curve before the next time? What could you have done differently to make sure that you were better prepared? And what data do you need to have in hand to be able to act preemptively? So thinking specifically about our current situation, is there a way that you could have prepared for this work from home, no travel scenario? Could you have had plans drawn up already that say, actually, if we have a situation where travel to a particular country is prevented, what is our fallback? And then looked at how you can infer that on a wider basis. Were there any signs that you missed? So could you have seen them sooner to be able to prepare more efficiently? And as an example of that, we heard from one particular US organization that actually managed to get ahead of the curve. So what happened was the CHRO started having his company work remotely back in January because his spouse was actually a doctor based in China and saw what was happening before it hit the US. So he had on the ground intel that allowed him to act in advance of it hitting the US, thus minimizing the impact to his business. So to get a bit of a better idea of the impact of our current crisis on your organizations, we've got a quick little poll here. So Rhonda, are you able to pull up the poll questions for us? Perfect. So how would you describe the impact of the novel coronavirus on your corporation? Would you say that it's been minimal, you're operating at normal levels, or with few localized disruptions? Would you say it's moderate? So you've experienced moderate general disruption in business with localized severe disruptions in countries that are heavily impacted by the coronavirus? Or would you say that it's actually severe? So you've had widespread severe disruptions of sales, your supply chain, and talent force. And we actually ran this poll in a webinar we held last week. And what I saw was that most companies indicated, probably unsurprisingly, that they'd seen the impact is somewhere between moderate and severe. So we saw a fairly even spread between the two, with a very, very small amount of people indicating minimal disruption. So I think that's really true of our current crisis. It's really something that is having that global effect, which on the flip side gives you a good scenario for getting people engaged to create a preparedness plan for if, when the next time occurs. So with that, Rhonda, have we had any results in?
Yeah, I think the results are a little different than your last one. I'm going to share them with you
Oh,
here. Here we go.
oh, interesting. That's obviously positive. I'm very happy for the organizations that are seeing minimal impact. One thing that's probably worth noting is it's likely to also depend on the type of industry that you're in. So what we've actually seen is a number of tech companies are pretty familiar with remote work. It's not really a big change to their organization to have to work remotely. So that could be one of the reasons that we're seeing a slightly higher impact, a slightly higher group of minimally impacted companies here. Thank you, Rhonda. Can you close that down? Thank you. So think about the pandemic. So it's really an affirmation for the need for great technology to underpin and support your program. So to help manage and support your global employees and ensure their health and safety. It's really about using your data to understand your risk. And I think what we've increasingly seen from our customer base is just how crucial it is to have good, solid, easily accessible data in a situation like this. So right from the basics, the very first critical question that you get asked is, where are our employees? And being able to locate them quickly, to the more sort of advanced challenges that happen further down the line, where you're being asked to assess the actual impact of the event that it has had or will have on your organization. So whether it's a financial impact, whether it's other wider impacts as well. So the first action in a crisis is, as you would expect, is always locating your employees, which in theory should be easy. It should be something you can do in a matter of minutes. unfortunately, the reality is that I hear from a lot of the market that this was the first point that a lot of mobility teams realized just how significant a struggle this crisis poses. So I've heard from several organizations about how they had to launch a big global effort to try and consolidate various regional spreadsheets, sometimes country by country spreadsheets, to try and identify their true global assignee population. And add to that, then having to identify family members accompanying each assignee as well. So it quickly becomes a really significant task if you don't have access to data in one single platform, but instead have to rely on spreadsheets and regional disjointed HR systems. And this is really one of the key things. Like, if you're looking after the safety of your employees, you need to be able to locate them quickly. So there really are a number of key challenges that your organization would typically face in a crisis, and we've kind of broken them into 4 buckets here. So first of all, thinking about your operational execution. It's really, really hard to respond effectively if there's no plan in place. And even if there is a plan, if the plan's not well publicized within your organization, you'll likely lose valuable time as people go about familiarizing themselves with the process. Looking at the second point, so siloed data and systems. So if you're having systems and data that's not talking to each other, if it lives in silos, it's extremely hard for one team to know what the other teams are doing, which then has an immediate knock-on effect on your processes and response time. In a crisis situation, it's key that you can access the information you need without having to search through multiple systems, or what also happens, having to wait for multiple contacts to respond, often across various time zones, which then causes further delays. Looking at compliance risks. So in a crisis situation, obviously health and safety takes precedence. However, there are also likely significant compliance risks that need to be addressed and handled. So trying to assess these and project with limited data is not only a challenge, but depending on the situation, could potentially also carry a financial risk for your organization. And then finally, fragmented systems. So as outlined with the first basic step of locating your employees, gathering information from multiple sources is time consuming, and it also makes it really difficult to know if the data is reliable. And this is really one situation where it's absolutely key that you get your information right. You do not have the liberty of forgetting about an employee. This is a situation where you need to be able to account for everyone quickly. So the main difference here is really time. Day-to-day challenges like immigration and tax legislation changes typically have significant lead times, making it easier to create that complete plan in advance. But with a crisis situation, time is of the essence. We have no control over it and need to react pretty much instantly, making extremely key decisions, often with little or incomplete data. And this is something that potentially has a significant impact on your employees' health and safety, but also on your business costs, immigration, tax, and other compliance and more. And you're being asked to do this without the full picture. And for each individual crisis, they can really bring their own particular set of challenges. So thinking about our current situation, you might be experiencing pushback from your business on cost associated with bringing assignees back early. I've certainly heard that across the marketplace where there's some negotiations about what needs to happen. Obviously, we need to bring people back, but who needs to carry that cost? Is it the home or the host? Thinking about any potential additional housing costs that might have cropped up associated with quarantining. Is it a business cost? Is it an employee cost? And often what I'm hearing is that these things are really being looked at on a case-by-case basis. There is no standard approach that you can pull out quickly unless you have a well-prepared plan. And impacts on immigration and tax situations. So given the current situation, what I'm hearing is that a lot of companies have allowed their assignees to return to their home country for the duration of the lockdown. So they're still being considered on assignment, but they've been allowed to essentially wait out the lockdown in their home country. how do you go about tracking these displaced workers? If you're working across different data sources, siloed systems, it's really hard to keep track of people on a day-to-day basis, but even more so if they're doing things that are out of the norm. And I think that's really ultimately the challenge that we see again and again in a crisis situation is assignees turning up in unexpected places. I hear even from companies that feel like they've got their finger on the pulse and they know where everyone is. In a crisis, it's not unusual that suddenly the expat that you didn't know based in Bermuda for the last 9 years comes out of the woodwork. And I think the last challenge that we're seeing right now, and I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing it as well, is having to work flexibly, first of all from home, but potentially also around, childcare arrangements and so on, making it much more of a juggling act. So not only are you having the challenge of working in an abnormal situation, but you're also dealing with having to make these key critical crisis decisions urgently. So now that we've laid out some of the challenges faced in a crisis, how do you go about assessing your program's crisis preparedness? And note that by this, I don't mean finding out what works and what doesn't work as you're going through the crisis. I mean proactively identifying how well you're set up to be able to react quickly in any given crisis situation. So first of all, thinking about your strategy. Do you have a crisis strategy? Does it even exist? If it exists, what does it look like? Do you know what it details? Who owns it? Are there various stakeholders across different parts of the business? I'd say that's highly likely because there are going to be a lot of people involved when a crisis hits. So you're likely having to deal with lots of different key players, and you need to be able to execute on that strategy flawlessly. How often is the strategy reviewed? How often is it updated? Is it every quarter, every year, after each crisis? It's not enough to have a strategy. It's a good first step, absolutely, but it needs to be well defined. It needs to be frequently reviewed. You need to make sure it's widely publicized and that you have clear ownership. So, and also thinking about the owners, are they responsible for making sure that the strategy is reviewed in light of each individual crisis after it's happened? So secondly, thinking about your data. What is the quality and the availability of the data you need? So think about your key data points for a crisis situation. How quickly can you truly access them? So I don't mean I think I can probably get this in a day. I mean, actually go through and test. See how quickly you can gather the data. Do you feel confident that the data you have is reliable? Like I said, these are people's lives. You need to get it right. Do you have the ability to model or forecast scenarios for your business unit based on both known and potentially unknown or projected factors? Ultimately, your data should allow you to respond quickly, make informed decisions, and also be able to review the total impact to your organization once the crisis has passed. And by total impact, I don't just mean who was moved from A to B. I mean, what was the total cost, what was the talent impact, and all the other implications that it brings. And finally, processes. Do they exist? Are they documented and publicized? So it's key to not only have your high level strategy, but also have a well-defined process to execute that strategy. So just like your strategy, think about who owns each process. How often is it reviewed? How often is it updated? Are people across your organization familiar with these processes? Are they communicated to all new joiners? It's really key the processes are well embedded, as otherwise you're going to lose valuable time in a crisis if people are having to learn the processes as they are actioning them. So with that, we've got one more poll coming your way. So Rhonda, if you could bring that up for us, please. So what we'd like to understand is how would you describe global mobility, your global mobility team's role in managing your corporation's response to the novel coronavirus? So A, were you heavily engaged? Global mobility was a critical member of the team formulating your corporation's response to the virus? B, was it influential? So while Global Mobility wasn't a full member of the executive team formulating the response, you were consulted frequently and influenced by, and it was influenced by your input. Were you consulted? So occasionally Global Mobility was asked for input on the corporation's response to the virus, but didn't have a significant impact on the strategy. Or were you merely informed, so not necessarily consulted, but informed of the corporation's response along with other parts of the business? Now again, we asked this same question last week, and what we saw, and which was actually slightly surprising to me, was that most people were either somewhere between consulted and influential, with a fair amount of people actually heavily engaged. And that's a really positive result to see, because I think what we often experience in the marketplace is that we hear that mobility doesn't always quite have a seat at the table. So I think this is really a great opportunity where mobility teams are being pulled in to use their very specific knowledge to give a real make a real impact to the corporation's response to a key situation. So I think this is a great way for mobility teams to come across and really showcase their values. And that was something I was really happy to see in the results last week. So Rhonda, do we have some results for this week?
Absolutely. Here we go. Share the results with you.
Oh, interesting. So again, fairly positive. We're seeing the biggest numbers across influential and consulted. So fairly consistent with what I saw last week. It's obviously very positive. Like I say, I'm glad to hear that people are involved in these decisions, and I think it really speaks to the value that you hold within your organizations. Thank you, Rhonda. So we've looked at the headline key items to review when you're assessing your program's crisis preparedness. And as we see in the headlines that you're facing in a crisis will typically be, where are my people? Should I still be moving people? What is the impact to the business? And when will this end? So in terms of assessing your crisis preparedness, I want to take a step back and break this down a little bit. So firstly, what are the key immediate questions you need to be able to answer when a crisis hits? Obviously, first and foremost, how many people do we have on the ground in the affected location? And then secondly, do they have family we need to account for? Of course, thinking about your business travelers, if they are part of your remit. If you're not, you're lucky because they're a lot harder to track. But if they are, do you know where they are? And then finally, what vendor support do you have in place? And the key piece here is really to understand what can you do quickly. So this is your initial very basic crisis assessment. Who is impacted and what can we do? So moving on to the next step and thinking about your crisis preparedness plan. So near-term questions you'll likely need to be able to address are things like, is there any impact to the employee's immigration and tax situation? I think that's typically a given, but what is that impact going to look like? How are we going to go about addressing these? Are we going to take a blanket approach? Are we going to do a case-by-case assessment? So create some thinking around how you want to go about assessing that. What talent are we planning on moving in and out of the region, and how do we plug those gaps? So obviously, this might be a situation where you're only seeing a crisis in a particular country or region, and then you need to look at how you can rejig the talent flow across the rest of your business to make sure that you have that business continuity. Is there going to be a business impact, a significant business impact? So thinking about cost, obviously time, but also if you're a project-based company, is there going to be an impact to project completion dates and so on that'll have a knock-on effect for your clients and potentially your reputation? And then how do we go about minimizing this business impact? What do we need to be thinking about? And this might be different depending on what industry you're in, but these are the kind of questions that you need to think about as you're assessing your crisis preparedness. So one more quick poll before we get to the last piece of the key question. So we'd like to understand, when do you think your organization will return to normal? Now, from what I hear, a lot of organizations have already put task forces in place to start looking at what the post-COVID world will look like. So companies are clearly moving from reactive to proactively trying to figure out the new normal. So do you think it'll be within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, or potentially more than 6 months? And I will be very curious to see what result we get here. Do we have some numbers in, Rhonda?
We do. Here we are here. They're pretty close.
Oh. I am not seeing any numbers. There we
It
go.
helps if
Thank
I
you.
hit the share button, sorry.
That's fine. Okay, that's a really interesting split. So I think part of this will obviously, like I said, depend on the type of industry that you're working in, how global your organization is. Obviously, if you're based in one country, you might find that you can return to normal quicker than a company that has global operations, because obviously, as we're seeing, the lockdown is lifting differently in different countries. So I think it's understandable to see the spread, and I think it's probably actually quite positive for business that we're seeing different companies affected differently. So now that we've looked at how, so thinking about the longer term and coming out the other side of the crises, what questions do you need to be able to answer around the longer term impact? So first of all, what is your crisis exit strategy? Is there one? Does it exist? Do you have you modeled multiple scenarios? If you are a global operation, it'll probably look different from, like I said, if you're a company with operations in one country, and so on. And what is the long-term effect of this particular crisis? And is there anything we can do to mitigate it in the future? So I think what we'll probably see out of this particular crisis is that there will be a lot more people working flexibly from home. Businesses might consider downscaling office locations. And I think that in itself will actually help mitigate the future if we see another pandemic. And then finally, this is obviously the question you always get from a business is, what is the true total cost of the event? But with this particular question, I don't just mean money. I mean, obviously there's a monetary component. You need to know, has it caused an increase in spend? Is there other things that we should be expecting? But also from a talent perspective, are there potentially employees that weren't happy with how the crisis was handled? Maybe their assignment was canceled and actually they thought they could have still moved, but you were being cautious and not moving anyone. So will you potentially have people that would choose to leave? And also from a reputation perspective, I expect, given the current situation, that this is probably not as relevant, but there might be situations where there's an impact to your actual business operations, and it could potentially affect your reputation as well if you're not able to deliver on projects in time, but your competitors have a different global makeup and they were able to swoop in and take over that project for you. So now that we've looked at how you can go about assessing your crisis preparedness, we're now going to move on and see what you can do to think about increasing your response effectiveness. So you might have found that you have a solid crisis preparedness plan. That's great, but it's still worth looking at whether there are ways to continue to improve it. So first of all, think about your strategy. As I've said, it's not enough to have a defined strategy and processes. You, your teams, your vendors, and the wider business need to know them end to end, inside out. Make sure you run regular updates. All new joiners are brought up to speed. Like I said, nothing slows down a crisis response like having to learn a new process as you're doing it. So the key message here is really that having a strategy is key, but knowing your strategy is critical. And then secondly, understanding the niche specialty of each of your vendors that you have in place. Make sure you have regular conversations with them to understand how they can support you in a crisis. So what is in your contract today versus other services that they offer under their umbrella? What you might find in a crisis situation is that you contract with a particular vendor in one location only, but you might need their support in a neighboring country. if you know in advance that they have operations in that neighboring country, that saves you the time of having to do that research during a crisis. And I really can't say just how many wonderful and creative collaborations I've seen between organizations and their vendors during the current crisis. I think it's really, it really tells of the partnership that I'm seeing that people have with their vendor landscape, understanding that we're all in this boat together and we're all trying to help to get through this. So one very last poll, I promise. If you can pull that up for us, Rhonda. Thank you. So thinking specifically around data, how accessible was data that you needed in order to manage the crisis, and what would you do differently? So was it very accessible? I had absolutely everything I needed at my fingertips and no changes were needed. Was it pretty accessible? So I had most of what I needed quickly, and with a little bit of help, I found the rest within a day or so. Perhaps we'll think about integrating a few more systems soon. Was it accessible? So you had to aggregate from various sources into a single view of the situation. Would be great to see everything in one place. Or did you find that actually you were missing information? So you really need some form of tool to help support your global talent mobility program. So based on what I see in the market today, my guess is going to be that we're probably going to see the biggest spread across accessible. I think depending on the organization, I think a lot of organizations are starting to work towards having one single source of truth for their mobility program and looking at connecting that in with their wider network of systems, vendors, and so on. I think a lot of people are starting to plan for it. I think there is still a lot of people who are not quite there yet. So some people have made the leap, which is great. I think they're seeing the immediate impacts and results they're getting from having one true single source of truth. But I think most of the people that I talk to across the market are still figuring out how to get to that stage. So Rhonda, do we have some results in?
For sure. You're close. Here we go.
Ah. Oh, I'm not far off. Well, that is really positive news, though. It sounds like most people have got their finger on the pulse with this, which is great. So obviously, you guys are a little bit further along from what I typically see. And this has obviously helped you respond quickly in this current crisis. So the last piece of increasing your response effectiveness is, you might have guessed it, is thinking about your technology. So being able to leverage one single source of truth. So take a look at the technology you have in place. A single source of truth is key if you need to act fast. You've got faster access to data, you can make better decisions, and you can assess the true impact of a crisis situation. If you're having to dig around various systems, various spreadsheets to try and get one picture, it invariably means that you're going to have challenges with the quality of the data. There might be timing issues. There might be discrepancies between numbers for different regions and so on. And it just makes it a much bigger exercise to be able to respond effectively, whether it's the simple layer of where are my people, or the more advanced challenges of what is the actual impact going to be from a cost perspective or talent perspective. So think about creating a success plan. So looking at crisis preparedness, first of all, identify your outcomes. Define your success criteria. So think about what would make your business say that the mobility team handled this in a proactive manner and provided above and beyond support. Now, obviously, ensuring employees' health and safety, that is obviously the key thing. But beyond that, what would be considered a success? Is it an ability to keep costs contained? Is it proactive solutions to reduce potential compliance exposures, or something completely different? Know the things that matter for your business. This is the ultimate firefighting situation. So being able to assess a situation quickly and make an informed decision can be critical. Next, think about mapping your processes to outcomes. So map your map the process that will meet each expectation. So some of these will be addressed by standard operating procedures. Other expectations will need to be discussed through maybe a modified process, and knowing in advance will allow for proactive resource and execution. And for each outcome, define a metric. So a metric is obviously a specific measurement that tells you whether you're meeting the expectation. And realistic parameters should inform the team and your business of what defines explicitly acceptable performance. And goals here are really a concrete feedback tool. And for each goal, establish a schedule. Knowing when an expectation must be met is as important as knowing what the expectation is. So just like the goal, the schedule has got to be realistic. Unrealistic plans will only result in poor quality deliverables and probably burned out staff because you've got so much on your plate anyway. And finally, for each expectation, assign responsibility. So when you assign responsibility for an expectation, you're identifying the individual or cross-functional teams to monitor and ensure attainment of the goal. And along the way, these people will then collect and maintain any process-related data. So think about how you can go about converting a pain point into a success. So in our current situation, the pain points that we're typically seeing are obviously interruptions, sudden interruption to sudden long-term travel interruptions. That was really hard to say. Challenges with getting access to data or being able to aggregate it quickly. What we've heard as an example from an organization is that they actually had a very detailed crisis plan, but what they found was that it was so detailed and cumbersome that it was actually nearly impossible to navigate in the moment. And then finally, what we're also seeing is that most companies haven't actually done any load testing for this particular type of crisis or necessarily for any crisis. So the risk you're seeing with not having a good plan in place is potentially higher costs. Current situation, you might find that you have employees where you have to address a lack of medical coverage in country, if they're caught mid-move, if they are in a third country. And you might have been too late to the game to react effectively. So this is where we're talking about what can you think about? Could you have acted sooner? So start thinking about anything that you might have heard, known, been aware of that could have meant you could have acted sooner. Of course, the tax and compliance implications that we've talked about along with visas. So having people return from assignment to wait out the lockdown at home is obviously going to have some impacts. How do you assess them? How do you track your people? And what are you going to do about it? And then from an employee perspective, there is also a risk of a poor employee experience. So you might see that actually you've had some employees that maybe weren't the most willing to move, but were doing it for career purposes and so on. And actually this is kind of just giving them one more reason to not want to move. So how can you turn this into success? So first of all, have a task team, have a crisis task team ready, and have policies outlined for these particular situations. Now, they may need to be a little bit broader than your general policies because, as you probably are seeing right now, there is going to be a lot of case-by-case situation, but you can certainly have some general guidelines that determine how you're going to assess each situation. And make sure that all your employees that can move, do move. So you might have seen employees that were really keen to go, but actually perhaps you took a little bit of a cautious approach and decided to halt all moves. Again, this could have an impact on employee experience as well. It could obviously have an impact on your talent if you're planning for that talent to be in the host location. So make sure that you assess whether you actually can successfully and safely move someone given the current situation. Of course, having a keen eye on cost and make sure that they're controlled or kept within acceptable limits. And again, this is where I'm probably thinking more along the lines of guardrails. It's hard to say down to the dollar how much something's going to cost if you're operating in a crisis situation, but you can certainly set some guardrails for upper and lower limits. And then finally, think about fire drills. So being able to react quickly in any crisis, or any unstable situation is ultimately going to help you drive success. So one really great example of this, let's explore the benefit of planning for instability or unpredictability so that effectively every scenario becomes the norm. So you're set up for the next crisis event. So a great example here is the Netflix Chaos Monkey tool, and I absolutely love this name because it is so memorable. So Chaos Monkey is a software tool that was developed by Netflix engineers to test the resilience and recoverability of their Amazon Web Services. And according to developers, Chaos Monkey was named for the way it wreaks havoc like a wild and armed monkey set loose in a data center. So the premise here is that the best way to avoid major failures is to fail constantly. And this contrasts obviously with what we're seeing right now in unexpected failures. So unlike unexpected failures, which often happen during the most inopportune times, Chaos Monkey can be run on a schedule, meaning that you can closely monitor the impact and failures as they unfold. So by employing Chaos Monkey, they're able to test resilience and recoverability. It allows simulated failures to occur at times when they can be closely monitored, and it helps prepare for major unexpected errors rather than just waiting for catastrophe to strike. And it really takes the guesswork out of how a crisis will be managed. So thinking about it with your crisis preparedness hat on, this is a really great way to prepare for unexpected crisis scenarios in a controlled environment, rather than having to put your plan to the test in a real crisis situation. So this way, it creates a safe environment for creating and resolving a crisis and really becomes the ultimate test for your crisis preparedness plan. And this dovetails really nicely into the last piece around post-crisis success. So looking at post-crisis success, one key step, if you do nothing else, do this, do a debrief. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of your crisis preparedness plan. Learn from past events. Think about, have you been through similar situations before? And is there anything that can easily be replicated and leveraged? So current situation is a great example. What we saw was that companies that had long-standing operations in APAC understood the seriousness of the disease much quicker, and because they've been through prior smaller scale outbreaks such as SARS and H1N1, so they were quicker and earlier to slow down their relocations globally while then managing expectations within their business. And I know it can be really hard to find time to do a proper postmortem, but they're really the best way to prepare for any future incidents. What worked well, what didn't, where did you get hung up, what processes weren't properly defined, what was missing from your plan that you had to create on the fly, can it be improved now, and so on. So look at your data. What did you collect? How did you collect it? Were there any known pitfalls? Did I have a crisis exit plan? How did we move from crisis back to business as usual? Did this happen as we expected? So review your crisis response plan after each incident and of course on a regular basis, and make sure you have that designated ownership and structure in place. So to sum up, in a globally interconnected world where we're seeing health situations, border regimes, and flight schedules often changing by the hour, you need accurate data and technology to help make the right decisions to keep your people safe and productive. So first of all, thinking about efficiency, being able to minimize that data duplication, the effort of gathering your data, and helping you streamline your processes end to end. Integrity, so making sure you've got complete and accurate data across all systems and vendors. So anyone that needs to interact knows that they've got exactly what they need and that it's reliable. Connecting your HR data, so making sure that you're combining your mobility data with your wider HR data, specifically in a crisis around talent and performance, so being able to make a talent swap if you need to. Global crisis, I can't see a lot of talent moving in and out, but if it's a crisis that contains a particular country or region, you might be looking at being able to plug talent gaps in other ways than what you had originally planned. And then finally, reporting and analytics, so leveraging the data and analytics to drive those greater insights. So use technology and data to underpin your crisis preparedness strategy. Look at what did I do? What did I learn? And then using the data to understand what should I do. And this is really where the value of a true global talent mobility platforms come in. So when we look at this, we see global talent mobility platform as key to an organization's success, both in day-to-day, but especially in a crisis situation. So a true global talent mobility platform should, first of all, of course, provide you with the tools and services that you need to run your program. It should also define the industry rules and standards and essentially give you a best practice framework to work from. It should build the connection. So there are a lot of moving parts when you're dealing with mobility. So you have various vendors, various business managers, various HR systems, bringing it all together in one easy to access place. And finally, turning every interaction into a product transaction. And by this, I mean everything that happens in the platform is a piece of data that you can then use to inform a future decision. And all of this, of course, while managing your end-to-end mobility interactions. So in a post-crisis world, I think what we'll see is it'll be different in many ways, but businesses will once again look to global economies for hiring key skill sets, provide international experience to retain top talent, and move people around the world to take advantage of business opportunities and gain competitive advantage. And having a true global talent mobility platform will allow them to do this not only during business as usual, but also in a future crisis situation. So with that, Rhonda, can you tell me if we've had any questions? And I think we've got a little bit of time for a couple of questions.
Yes, and absolutely. We have some fantastic questions coming in. I'm sure you'll be pleased to get them. First one, Joan asks, are you seeing any organizations testing or running practice scenarios as a means to assess their crisis preparedness plan?
So that's a great question. I would love to say, yes, I'm seeing all the organizations I talk to doing this. I think the reality is that unless an organization has been through a crisis that had a significant business impact, then most people, it's not top of most people's to-do list. I think what we'll see coming out the other side of our current crisis is that this is going to become much more widespread. So I think what we're going to see is that there's going to be not just a push from mobility teams themselves, but also from the business and the companies, boards and so on, to understand how could we have prepared better? Did we do the best we could in that situation? And that's going to certainly impact mobility teams as well. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of outcome of the current situation, not only for those that don't have a plan, creating plans, and for those that had plans, assessing how well they worked, and then looking at how you can be better prepared, even better prepared next time.
Great, thank you. And folks, just a reminder, there's still a bit of time, so we have some questions in here, but please put questions in the Q&A, and if we run out of time, the folks at Topia will follow up afterwards. So here again, Nina, question, what are two or three biggest challenges you're hearing about in the industry related to the coronavirus?
That's another great question. I think it actually differs a little bit depending on the type of organization, but I would say sort of broad brush. Obviously, it's data, access to data. I think I worked in-house. At the time I worked in-house, we did not have a global system. In a crisis like this, I can imagine exactly how hard it would be to get my hands on everything I needed. So what I'm hearing is that people are struggling to get data in a timely manner. So often they can get their hands on it, but it's not always as quick as they would like, and they're spending a significant amount of time on it. And I think the other piece is really trying to understand how to plan for the next stage. So understanding what is the actual wider impact going to be to our organization. So we've had to potentially move a lot of people back home. Are we going to look at sending them back out on assignment at the end of this? What other scenarios are there? So really trying to figure out what does the new normal look like, and no one has that magic 8 ball. So I think it's really trying to plan out as many scenarios as possible, and then essentially be as prepared as you can as we move into business as usual.
Okay, Let me dip in here again. Yeah, another one here. What are you seeing across the industry in terms of HR organizations preparing for life post-coronavirus?
Yeah, so that probably dovetails nicely from the previous question. So I think what I'm seeing, which I actually think is a really positive move, is that people are moving beyond the initial sort of, I don't want to call it knee-jerk reaction, but the initial reaction of what do we need to do? And it's slowly becoming a little bit more of the new normal. And a lot of companies are now thinking about or have already set up task forces to start planning out for the post-corona world. I think right now a lot of it is still in a planning stage. I think over the next couple of weeks and months, as we're seeing different countries starting to open up on different timescales. Again, it will differ by the footprint that your company has and how wide or how sort of unlocked a country becomes. But I think what we're seeing is essentially creating plans for multiple scenarios. So, you know, a plan that says, what if we have to stay with status quo for the next 12 months? Is that going to work? Do we need to downscale the business? Do we need to think about actually repatriating all the people who are technically still on assignment but have been allowed to come home for lockdown? Planning for, okay, if certain countries open up, are we going to move people just because they've opened up? There is still a risk of a second peak if people aren't careful around the different strategies that are being put in place for coming out of lockdown. So it's sort of how cautious are you going to be, modeling out those different scenarios. And then I'm sure from a mobility perspective, making sure that they also understand the not just the cost impact, but also the talent impact that those different plans will then have.
Perfect. I think we have time for another question here from, excuse me if I don't pronounce this correctly, Abdel. Can we apply this technique on global, local, or sector crisis, or we have different strategy?
I think that's a really great question. I think you can absolutely apply this framework on any type of crisis, whether it's country specific, region specific, or global. I think you will find that there are different learnings that come out of each, but I think the general strategy absolutely applies to all different scenarios. You'll probably find that you might have certain sections where you will spend less time, other sections where you might need to dive deeper depending on the type of crises or the type of global footprint that you're dealing with, but it's certainly a framework that translates regardless of how the crisis is localized.
Okay, and I think we could squeeze one in, and if you need more time, you can obviously follow up with this afterwards. But Shreya asks, how do you manage the cost for crisis management for the crisis management team?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that probably comes down to your individual business. I think the reality is that it depends on how wide an impact the crisis has had on your general business population versus your assignee population. So you might have a relatively small assignee population. So in that case, obviously the impact is going to be generally spread across the business. So everyone has to work from home. There might be some additional costs for your across your assignee population of having to repatriate them as someone. Those I would expect would be covered by business unit individually. But I think if you have a business that's globally diverse with a significant assignee program, I wouldn't be surprised if an organization chooses to actually roll all the specifically crisis associated costs into one overhead that then gets charged out across your entire population, because there is likely going to be an impact to nearly all, if not all of your business. But again, as we saw from some of the poll responses earlier, some people did indicate that they'd seen minimal impact. And in that scenario, it might be a localized country or population that needs to carry that cost.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so Nina, thank you so much for such a wonderful, informative presentation today. Lots of great comments coming in, and so thanks to yourself and thanks to Topia. As well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you would like to view the webcast again, the archive recording will be available on hr.com within 24 hours. Your webcast credit will show in your hr.com account within 2 business days, and we will also send you an email with the credit information. Your feedback is important to us. It's important to Nina and the folks at Topia. So please be sure to fill out the exit survey. It opened in a new browser on your computer. And this concludes the webcast. Any final comments there, Nina?
Just one final comment. We have a couple of resources that are available for free on the Topia website, so please do feel free to visit it. There's a really great tool that lets you assess your company's global talent mobility readiness. So it's not specifically to crisis, it's just to see an initial indication of how well you're set up from a global talent mobility perspective. And also we have a great perspective from the IDC about the importance of global talent mobility in today's world. So those are some great resources. I just wanted to flag them. They're free, so feel free to go on our website and leverage them.
Excellent. I'm glad that we did not miss that. All right. Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.